Good evening, all. I'm Gargi Alwani. On behalf of ACM Goa Professional Chapter, it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for today's talk, that is Professor Snehanshu Saha. Professor Saha holds a Ph.D. from University of Texas-Arlington and is a professor in the Department of CS&IS, APPCAIR, which is the AI Research Center at BITS PILANI KK Birla Goa campus. He has contributed more than 100 articles in top 10 conferences and journals, including several IEEE Transactions. He's a senior member IEEE, senior member ACM, and a fellow IETE. He has contributed to the theory of machine learning, deep learning, and meta-heuristics, and developed several state-of-the-art methods in deep learning-based classification task optimizers for non-convex problems. He has also proposed a novel anomaly detection method for univariate and multivariate time series data and interpretable tools in deep learning. Beyond his contribution to AI through academics, he is also a co-founder of HappyMonk AI, an AI product company. Today, Professor Saha will be sharing his insights on a crucial topic that lies at the heart of machine learning and deep learning, which is learning rates and loss functions, a critical tool for optimization. His talk promises to delve into intricacies of these fundamental concepts, shedding light on their significance, practical implementations, and the critical role they play in training efficient and accurate machine learning models. So without further ado, I invite you to join me in giving a warm and enthusiastic welcome to Professor Saha. So let us all look forward to this talk. Thank you.
Okay, so I hope my screen is visible, right?
Yes, it's visible.
Yeah, okay. It's just that. Okay. All right. So I think, yeah, okay. So all right, thanks Dr. Gargi for the kind words. I'm very happy to be here and talking to ACM. So I mean, my abstract and the title have been shared already, and even though the title suggests that the talk would be mostly on the learning rate and loss functions in deep neural networks, I mean, I would like to say that, I mean, if time permits, and I would very much like to add another angle to it, okay, while trying to predict things using deep learning architecture and mechanisms. So which is the interpretability angle. Okay, so that's something. I mean, fitting too many things into the title is always a problem. Too long, did not read, and so on and so forth. So hello everyone. This is Snehanshu from the Center for Learning Theory at APPCAIR BITS PILANI Goa campus. And I will leave my presentation with Dr. Gargi so that she can share with all of you, because the first slide, as you can see, there is the GitHub repository code, which you can actually use if you want. So just one slide, I mean, because where I come from, we come from APPCAIR, which is a center set up by a couple of alumni from BITS PILANI campus. About $1 million US contribution, and the center is about 4 years old. This is part of the Department of Computer Science at BITS PILANI, with about 10 faculty members, including myself, and Ashwin leads the center on all campuses. And so we are doing okay, I guess. Probably about, in the 4 years, we have about 400 plus publications, mostly in top tier. I mean, IEEE and ACM Transactions and top conferences. We also feature in the CS ranking now, along with several IITs and ISCs and other places. And the focus at APPCAIR Goa campus is mostly on the conceptual side of machine learning and deep learning. Less on the applied application side. We do some application stuff and work with industry and all that. And here are our donors, Anuradha and Prashant Palakurti, were the alumni of BITS PILANI. So, okay. Now, typically when people talk about these days, I mean, everybody does deep learning. I also do deep learning, right? I mean, so there has always been a slight, I wouldn't say slight, I mean, it's kind of, niggle in the sense that a lot of people are still uncomfortable with deep learning. I mean, including myself. And one of the reasons is that, interpretability like, you know, what we try to do in predictive analytics is that we try to find out, I mean, try to predict a response variable, right? I mean, it could be an univariate or one variable or multivariate or whatever. But at least what we'd like to know is that if I change my input parameters, I should be able to control the response, as well as I should be able to know how much, I mean, what is the dependence of the change in my response parameter with respect to my input parameters, right? This is something that people have been seeing in predictive analytics and slash statistics for at least 150 years. Now, then deep learning comes in suddenly, and then you really don't know what is happening around you. I mean, you have a black box model, right? You feed some data sufficiently large enough. And there are also kind of debates on how large is large, right? And then you suddenly see some magic, right? I mean, at least in terms of how you are predicting the labels, true labels as true ones, the false ones as the false ones, so on and so forth, right? Then a lot of people complain about, okay, in the process of doing so, in the process of this black box way of doing things, we have lost the elegance. I mean, pattern recognition, small data pattern recognition, if you think about it, and the big data machine learning, there is some gap, right? Because small data pattern recognition never had this kind of problems. Now, so the idea is, so one of the focal points of my talk today is that, are there things that people used to do in small data pattern recognition which we can port to big data? I mean, so sort of, you know, deep learning scenarios. Are there some techniques that we can borrow? And of course, we have to recalibrate those techniques, rewrite those techniques so that it fits into the deep learning architecture, so that, you know, at least the elegance is not ignored. And along with elegance, maybe we get some additional incentive of interpretability. So that's the idea. So from small data pattern recognition to big data pattern recognition, I and a lot of my colleagues around me, not only in BITS PILANI, but otherwise, we hope that we can see a re-emergence of the methodological elegance, okay, in what we do, which is predicting, okay? And in the process, apart from the performance metrics that we measure, are there other metrics that we can measure? Can we do it with using cheaper hardware, cheaper carbon emission? Can we speed up the computations? Can we have some native trainability? Okay, which means by native trainability, what I mean is that, okay, what are the things that I can still train on my 8 GB RAM laptop? Okay, all right. And so that there is limited dependency on cloud high performance computing servers and so on. So these are common problems that we face here, right? I mean, you read a paper in NeurIPS, right? Or, you know, IEEE or AAAI, and you read that part, like for a small 4 or 5 lines on the computing and the hardware requirement in the paper, where the authors mention that, okay, we use 128 cores, we use 256 cores and so on, right? I mean, so people may not care about this anymore, but I think I do still care. So anyway, so the considerations are, I mean, you know, I mean, volume, velocity, veracity, you all know this. These are characteristics of big data, how we can efficiently process this based on the kind of applications that we have. So previously, I mean, and a lot of my motivation, I mean, a lot of the techniques that me and my collaborators have come up with, actually the inspiration and the first problem that we attacked, or first problem that we looked at, but I mean, at least in 80% of my cases, those problems came from astronomy, right? So one big advantage of astronomy data is it's open source. You don't have to beg anyone, and you don't have to really care about the privacy of the data, right? So, and they gather huge amounts of data, but the trouble with astronomy data is, because there are lots of different kinds of instruments are involved, you have this instrumental error and noise and stuff like that, okay, which you expect. I mean, since the size of the data set is large, you expect to use some deep learning method or devise some deep learning method, along with the fact that, you know, you have to figure out a way of cleaning up the noise as well, or, you know, design a method which is robust to label noise, covariate shift, and things like that. Okay. So here are some examples and the size of typical size of the data sets that you usually deal with. Okay. In fact, the latest one that is coming our way, which is the Synoptic Survey Telescope, it's like every day 200 petabytes of data we expect. So we don't even have the, you know, mechanism to store that kind of data. So it's pretty much, you know, prediction on the fly. Okay. So, we know this. So apart from this is typically, some large, organizational wise data versus, what Google Analytics does and things like that, right? So the motto is learn deep, learn with deep neural networks, but can we learn fast, right? And the second question is, can we slightly move away from the black boxing? And along with the black boxing, there comes other devils or other bandits kind of thing, which are like, there are a bunch of hyperparameters in deep neural networks that we need to optimize. We either optimize or use some heuristic, or, we use some common wisdom, so on and so forth, right? So is there a way to avoid that, or is there a way to bypass that and kind of arrive at similar performance metrics, or even maybe even better? Okay. Well, this is like, this particular slide is self-explanatory. I'm not going to get into the real depth of it. This slide particularly tells you the concerns that people have, including, people like Michael Jordan, even though these days Michael Jordan is very much into deep learning, right? But, this is a common problem. That deep neural networks lead to meaningless false inferences, which means, you change the parameter slightly, and then your class level prediction goes from 0 to 1 just for the binary classification problem. This happens a lot. Okay, examples, and then the kind of money that you spend in order to build, a framework which will process your deep learning kind of job, or support your deep learning kind of different deep learning kind of architectures, including the transformers. I'm not even talking about the large language models, because those are that kind of infrastructure we at BITS can't even think. Forget about it. It's only Facebook or, Microsoft, people like Microsoft they can afford, right? So, and then by deep neural network, I also kind of, I'm referring to fully connected deep neural networks. I'm not talking about, pruned deep neural networks and things like that. So there are some things which are good, right? So the different kinds of architectures that people in the community have proposed, and they are used to process vision jobs with some degree of efficiency. There are some open data sets which people have come up with. Some of good things, some of the tools that come up in the recent times, right? Particularly Julia, in the last couple of years evolved a lot. Other than, Python and other things which people are used, right? Now, one thing is that the training time, right? Which, in fact, there is a famous paper by Simon Dew in 2018, I think, I forgot the year. This basically says that, a deep neural network, fully connected feed-forward deep neural network, will actually take exponential time to escape the saddle points in the loss surface. So this particular study that the results that I'm sharing with you, it was done by Karen Ho before the GPT models broke into the picture, right? So what a bunch of guys in UK did was that they did an experiment, and they were measuring the equivalent carbon emission that comes out by lieu of training a deep neural network. And what they found out was interesting. It says that approximately, if I keep 5 large cars, American cars, not the small ones that we drive here, the large American cars, the truck, Toyota truck kind of a thing, if I keep 5 cars running simultaneously for its entire lifetime, okay, so that's the amount of carbon one reasonably large, and these are pre-GPT models, remember, right? And reasonably large language model will generate. So just imagine, okay? As I said, people don't care, right? Most people, particularly the ones who definitely came up with ChatGPT, they don't care. But nonetheless, and then there are other problems, right? False, meaningless inferences, sometimes which led MIT to apologize because of this tiny image dataset fiasco, where it turned out that the training, the bias in the training was such that certain people belonging to certain race were labeled as really with ugly racial slurs. So MIT had to apologize, pull down the dataset, rectify it, and re-upload, and all that, right? So these are some of the problems, right? Uncertainty in prediction, along with the energy consumption and the carbon footprint and the training time that deep neural networks incur. So there are a bunch of problems. Of course, there are good things. Now, one thing that deep neural networks do very well, right, which is, and which a lot of traditional machine learning classifiers struggle, is that, if you have a bunch of data sets and if you do a feature plot, which is the first thing that any first course in machine learning that students should take, and they should do it, is that you plot, you have two, excuse me, someone talking? No. Okay. So if there are a bunch of, let's say there are there are three classes, right? And this is taken from stars, galaxies, and quasars and astronomy data set. And you do a feature plot, and you see that, try to see whether the objects belonging to different classes, whether they could be separated by a line. Clearly, what you can see here is that that's not the case. So I cannot possibly draw a line or two lines or two hyperplanes in such a manner that it will separate out the objects in a linear fashion. So that means the decision surface is nonlinear, right? So deep neural networks with sufficiently large data corpus solve this problem very efficiently. Okay. Which pretty much support vector machine kernels also do. Right, which is why I have this, and a lot of people also, a couple of papers I have read, and I kind of believe that, if you really think about a large, deep enough and wide enough neural network, it's actually a kernel machine. So pretty much what a kernel does is that you will have a lower dimension to higher dimension embedding. So what you pretty much see as a nonlinear decision surface in a lower dimension, it gets mapped onto a linear decision surface in the higher dimension, as you can see here. Right, with a kernel which has to satisfy certain conditions of inner products and so on and so forth, right? Like Marsa conditions. Okay, so this is something that deep neural networks do very well. Okay, however, what it doesn't do very well is something, and this is like, if you look at the image carefully, and this is not a fake image, this is a real image. This is a former student of mine. Okay, it's currently a postdoc at Toronto. So I hope you can see a laptop here. I hope you can see a fridge here, a refrigerator, and a laptop, right? And you see there is a the lowest drawer in that refrigerator, because in the refrigerators in the US and Canada are pretty large, right? Pretty big. So he was training a deep neural network, and his laptop got so much heated that he had to keep in that refrigerator lower drawer for some time, so that the laptop regains the normal temperature. Okay, so such as things, because like me, he also believes in sort of training a lot of things natively, and this is something that I was referring to as a native training. Okay, it doesn't happen, of course. You cannot do a GPT training here, but so what's the point of saying all of this? The point of saying all of this is that, at the heart of a learning problem, whether it's a regression or a classification or a clustering or even anomaly detection kinds of problems, at the heart of all of these different kinds of learning problems, right, is optimization. So the question is, how do I optimize? What should I be looking when I'm optimizing stuff? Is there some kind of a hardware optimization, or is there something like an algorithmic optimization that you can do? Sometimes, at least because I run a startup, I know that sometimes you would actually have to do an engineering optimization at the pipeline. You can't, despite all of the methods that you have written, some sort of engineering optimization have to be done at the pipeline. I'm not going to talk about that in this. Okay. And as far as possible, kind of get rid of expensive network architectures. By that, I mean, if possible, get rid of too many hidden layers, too many neurons, and so on and so forth, and possibly too many weight updates, which means I want to reduce the number of epochs in order to get to a sufficiently good and quantifiable with certain degree of confidence classification performance or regression performance and things like that. So this kind of a problem is known as a bandit optimization problem in deep neural networks, and the bandits are the hyperparameters. Okay. Of course, what you need are techniques, basically tools from advanced calculus. Okay, pretty much from advanced calculus. Okay, Sometimes people use chaos, sometimes people use chaos, differential equations and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, everybody knows, I think most of you know that, the performance benchmarks, you should be looking at how accurate your predictions are, how many epochs you took to converge to a minima or a maximum, what is. Along with that, I always insist that I think it's pertinent now to also compute your CPU memory utilization as well as carbon footprint. Okay. And these are computable. If you run your code on GPU, at least these are computable. What we should avoid, inferences that make no sense. Now, in order to understand this, we need to understand, what does it really mean? What really, is there really uncertainty in the prediction, right? And it's not about just the regression problems as well as classification problems. Avoid certain mistakes like set up a problem wrongly, setting up something. These are things that you should avoid. I see some students here, so which is why, okay. And then you should avoid something which MIT ImageNet, tiny ImageNet couldn't, which is that, don't come up with an algorithm which leads to ethical, social, racial misdemeanor. Okay. So I will start with some use cases before I get into the elegance part. Okay. Now, the use cases that I have are some regression use cases. Okay. And people who have dabbled in machine learning, they know that there are certain data sets which are, like California housing data sets, Boston housing pricing data set, energy efficiency. So the house pricing data sets are like, they're not a univariate regression problem. There are a bunch of input parameters, right? Distance from the city center, distance from the health facilities, how many bedrooms, what's the square meter area, distance from other commercial things. Is it inside a residential? There's a bunch of parameters there, okay, based on which you kind of estimate the, house prices, right? California as well as Boston. I right now don't remember which one is larger. I think California is a larger, bigger data set, but anyway. So the usual approach is train a deep neural network, right? Use a heuristic loss, whichever heuristic loss you want, right? And then, kind of sort of tune your hyperparameter for optimum performance. Okay. So this is where we thought that we will probably do something else. Okay. Now, remember, I think, I don't know which was the slide number. I said that, I think it was slide number 4 or something. I said that, there are certain things which used to work very well in small data pattern recognition. Is there a way we can import those techniques to deep neural networks as well? Okay. So that's something that I would be talking about for the next, 25, 30 minutes. So here are some certain standard problems, right? These are standard regression problems, right? So here, are some results. I'm just starting with some, I'll just show you with some results, okay? So what you can see here is that usually what happens in deep neural networks, that there is this learning rate, right? Which is a hyperparameter that needs to control the error, right? In the loss landscape. Now, this learning rate is usually set as a constant, like sometimes 0.1, sometimes 0.01, sometimes even smaller, right? And then you can probably tune it while running, or maybe on the fly. If you can tune it on the fly, otherwise you tune it afterwards, you train it, and so on and so forth. So there are some benchmarks that people have come up with for both California, Boston, and energy efficiency. Okay, you set those benchmarks as a loss, basically. So the second column that you see is a loss threshold, right? And the third column that you see is the number of epochs to reach that particular threshold. Now, these are benchmark thresholds, right? What you see on the last column is also number of epochs, but it is different from the third column in the sense that in the fourth column, constant learning rate was not used. Something else was used, okay? For now, let's just say that this is some adaptive learning rate that we have used, okay? And the loss function is a mean absolute error that was used, not the mean square error, which is usually used in a regression problem, right? And then also there is another evaluation where we did not actually care about setting a threshold and then running the experiment. We let the experiments run on both constant learning rate as well as the adaptive learning rate. And we wanted to see where the loss value saturates. Okay, so that's the second tip. Okay, so I hope there is no confusion regarding understanding the difference between the two, right? This is just an efficiency test. Okay, and these are the loss plots. So interestingly, you can see the red one is the adaptive learning rate, right? And the blue one is the constant learning rate. Okay. So at least I think this was for the California data and this was for the Boston. I don't remember which one is which, but that's okay. You can see in the constant learning rate in one, I think the constant learning rate is 0.1. There's the blue one and the red one is some learning rate. Okay. So it's like, it starts, at least what you can see as far as the red one, I don't care about the blue one. When you look at the red one, right, you can see that it starts at some large value initially, right? Okay, and then rapidly drips. And then sort of it can probably have a little bit of wobble because you are looking at stochastic gradient descent kind of algorithm, right? And then it kind of becomes steady and, sort of reduces and then will saturate at one point of time. So these are the loss landscape or loss values when you use either an adaptive learning rate or a constant learning rate. Okay, we have already seen, at least for the 3 data sets that I have mentioned, the performance on the adaptive learning rate is better. Okay, all right, but is this the only incentive? Okay, so the outcome that we see is, so now I'm going to tell you what this is about, right? So what this is about, the outcome that you see is actually an outcome of an adaptive learning rate guided by the Lipschitzness of the loss function. Okay, I'll tell you what this Lipschitzness is about, right? But before I tell you that, let me tell you, in small data pattern recognition, Lipschitzness is known. I mean, it is known that if a function is Lipschitz, right, then your gradient descent will terminate in a finite number of iterations, so on and so forth. So these are results known in the small classical machine learning regime as well, along with all the no free lunch theorems and so on. But in the deep learning, we kind of integrated this idea just to see whether it accelerates things out. And then, look at the theory. Okay. Now, what you can see here, that when I use the mean absolute error, by the way, which comes from the median quantile loss. So when you set your quantile at tau is equal to 0.5, and you get the mean absolute error, right, as a loss function. So in contrast with the mean square error, which assumes that your errors are normally distributed, right? Mean absolute error does not have any such assumption. So it comes from an asymptotic Laplacian. You don't need to worry about that, but at least it does not have to fit into a standard normal distribution, right? Okay. And because my talk is about loss functions and learning rates, I mean, I will also talk about another loss, which is quantile loss, right? Also, when we ran this on quantile losses, we also observed similar speed in convergence by nearly 20 times. Okay. And as you have seen from the loss function value, the adaptive learning rate, the first initial few learning rates for the first set of epochs is large, but then it gradually comes down. Okay. All right. Now, so, and this came from the theory of differential equations. I don't have the time to go through all the theory, right? But this kind of adaptiveness can be adapted to activation functions as well. Okay. Now, so this is what this alpha is, what is called the learning rate, right? Okay. What we propose is the following. We say that, okay, look, we have usually in regression, we use the mean square error. How does the mean square error look like? It looks like a parabola, right? Like a soup bowl. Or in classification, we use a binary cross entropy or cross, right? Okay. Both of these loss functions have nice properties. Nice in the sense they are continuous, they're smooth everywhere. You can differentiate both of them to the Hertz content at the same time, but you do not need to assume double differential. or even of the higher order, right? Now, all you need is that your first order derivative. So you ideally need a loss function whose first order derivative is continuous, okay, and bounded. Okay, which means you can bound it between a lower value and an upper value, right? And this comes easily from the mean value theorem. And then what you do is the learning rate, you set the learning rate for that particular loss function as the inverse of the Lipschitz constant. Okay. And for each customizable or your predefined loss functions, can you find the Lipschitz constant? Can you compute the Lipschitz constant? If the answer to that question is yes, I find the Lipschitz constant and it's simply the inverse of that Lipschitz constant. Now, the question is why we do such that. So we were able to show that if we do this, then we actually force the weight updates to be always between 0 and 1. So there we don't have to deal with large weight updates, right? So we can constrain the change in the weight updates, right? So this is a weaker condition than assuming the gradient of the function being Lipschitz continuous, right? But that's a much stronger condition. And because this is a weaker condition, we can not only use it to loss functions like mean square error and binary cross entropy, we can extend this Lipschitzness to mean absolute error as well as quantile losses. Okay. Because why I'm talking about mean absolute error and quantile losses, they are way more interpretable than mean square error. Okay. All right. So this is the property of any function which is Lipschitz satisfies this property. Okay, which means the diffs so W1 and W2 are your inputs. As you constrain your input, right, your corresponding functional values are also constrained by that constant L. Okay, all right. And if you can somehow, and it comes from the mean value theorem, and as I said, the first derivative needs to be bounded or the gradient needs to be bounded. I don't require any differentiability assumption on the gradient, right? And this is what it really means. So Lipschitz, it's like your lazy partner. I mean, no matter what you do, how much force you apply or how much convincing it takes, I mean, that your lazy partner may not be able to do anything. He doesn't want to move and things like that. So this is what Lipschitz says. So you have these two cones, right? And any function which is Lipschitz, which is represented by this red curve here, I mean, no matter what kind of input you give, large enough inputs also, right? This function, any function which is Lipschitz continuous, is always bounded between the cones, those two cones, which means, I mean, the rate of growth of the function you can always control. Okay, so it's a nicely behaved function, extremely nice property, and turns out that a bunch of functions actually are Lipschitz, and we can use them as loss functions suitably in a deep neural network setting. Okay, so assumption wise we are minimal, right? Okay, and the argument is we set the learning rate as the reciprocal of the Lipschitz constant. Okay, so I have already shown you the experimental data. This is a direct outcome of this assumption. That's exactly what we did when we did those experiments on those toy data sets. Right now, so if I simply take the mean square error as my loss function, right? So these are in the vectorial notation, and M is the number of training examples, right? We can compute the Lipschitz constant. So first we can treat the regression problem as a standard statistical regression problem, and then we can sort of frame the regression problem in a deep neural network setting, and we can show that the Lipschitz constant that we derive, right, which is a straightforward calculation, the Lipschitz constant that we derive are equivalent irrespective of whichever framework you are going to use, right? Okay, so you can see that there is a norm X transpose X, which is computable, right? Y transpose X, this particular thing has to be there, has to be some heuristic. And so if you know the K, and if you know the number of training samples, you can actually find the Lipschitz constant. You can compute the Lipschitz constant. And then using the chain rule in gradient descent, and we also know that the gradients get smaller and smaller, right, as you progress. So using all of those fundamental properties in deep neural networks, right, we can actually figure out for the binary classification cross entropy loss, the Lipschitz constant is just actually the norm is missing here. I mean, for some typo, I apologize. So you should read this as the norm of X, right? Where X is your input data set and divided by 2m. Similarly, for the multi-class classification also, you should read that X as the norm of X, right? Okay. Anyway, so what does this do for us? So I really don't have to worry about tuning the learning rate anymore. That's what it's telling us, right? So it auto-adjusts itself after every epoch. And this is basically solving the same regression problem, right? And we can show that if I set the learning rate as the inverse of the Lipschitz constant, then I can get a convex quadratic bound, okay? And if I set an error threshold, which means where should I stop? I mean, after getting, doing multiple epochs, where should I really stop? And I can also find that particular bound, right? If I set an error tolerance, okay? All right, and it turns out that it's of the order of 1 over epsilon. So this is something that can be proved. I mean, for if you take mean square error and mean absolute error as well. And it also turns out that adding a regularization term while computing the Lipschitz constant is also not a difficult. So point is, you have the loss function and then you add a regularization form, you are still able to compute the Lipschitz constant, and you're still able to compute the learning rate. It will just be the formula, right? So whether your activation function is ReLU or softmax, I mean, we can apply this, right? Irrespective of that. Sigmoid, it will be a slightly problematic because sigmoid, the problems of sigmoid, right? But the point is, the framework is independent of activation functions, simply because we don't want to use sigmoid for the same reason sigmoid is not preferred anymore these days, right? I mean, because of the gradient saturation. So we have created a pipeline using this, and that code is available in GitHub folder, right? So basically, what we achieve is progressing from parameter handling. In the parameter handling space, we progress from tuning to selection, right? Okay. And this leads to cheaper computation. I have already shown there is actually 5 to 20 times speed up, right? So this speed up reflected in not only the number of epochs it requires to converge, but also reduced carbon footprint and so on. Okay. So, and if somehow you are able to also, if you have a parameterized activation function, if you somehow figure out an automated way to control those parameters of the activation function as well, you have a complete pipeline, right? So you can actually control the bias and the variance in both ways. But anyway, so what we have actually is, I have something, at least for the toy data set, which saves me a bunch of iterations, right? Without compromising on the key precision performance, right? Recall and other things. Okay. So our first set of experimentation was on public data set, right? We also have observed improvement in CPU and RAM utilization as well, right? And let's call this parsimony computing for now. And also, this was not magic. We were able to do some theory and convince ourselves that, okay, this is happening for a reason, right? Because when you keep changing the learning rates, it's basically selecting for an optimal value of the hyperparameter, in that space, parameter space, right? We no longer do that, right? So it's basically finding out the next value of the learning rate automatically as you keep learning along the data. Okay, so that sort of explains why. Okay, additional nice things is that you can compute this Lipschitz constants for mean absolute error as well, which is really nice, because mean absolute errors are robust to level noise. Okay, which is a property that mean square errors do not have because of the square term. Nonetheless, so the point is, the experimentation on sustainable AI, which is when, why do I want to optimize? I want to optimize because I want to achieve certain things at a sort of a critical space. I mean, I don't want to spend too much of my resources, right? So the next experiment was done on a much bigger data set, which was, several GBs in training data. is basically, regressing or like finding out or predicting landmark target genes from landmark genes. So it is a gene expression inference problem in a typical human genomics. There are about 22,000 genes, out of which about 1,000 are earmarked as landmark genes, and target genes are ones which mutate and evolve, right? So if you have some set genes and then you have a set of other genes which evolve, then you can think of this as a regression problem, right? Okay. So we thought, why not? Okay, we have this deep learning framework with this Lipschitz adaptivity. Let's try to adapt this framework to this particular data set, right? Turned out that there was already an existing state-of-the-art optimizer with the constant learning rate and things like that. And that network architecture was kind of large. That network architecture was actually first they did it with 3 hidden layers, fully connected neural networks. Each hidden layer had 9,000 neurons. So you can imagine the total number of connections, right? Okay. And what we decided was that we will drop one layer. We'll drop one layer. So that means dropping one layer of 9,000 neurons. And of course, if you drop one layer of 9,000 neurons, you're also getting rid of all a bunch of subsequent connections, right? So your network architecture is already cheaper. But the point is, well, you did that, fine, okay? Does it really help you in terms of achieving what you want to achieve, in terms of your prediction performance, right? So it turns out we have done slightly better compared to the gene inference, but then it gets saturated, right? So once again, the red one is the Lipschitz adaptive learning rate, and the blue one is the constant learning rate, right? And then we also, just so that we are fair, we have compared with a bunch of other different learning rate paradigms, like constant learning rate decay, exponential learning rate decay, cyclic learning rates, and things like that, right? But what we wanted to see was that then instead of having so many neurons in one hidden layer, we also experimented with reducing the number of neurons, like 1,500 neurons, 500 neurons, and so on. And we did not see significant drop in performance. So if you are willing to compromise a little bit on the performance, and you can sufficiently prune your network by quite a large extent, right? Okay, and still retain the performance, okay, with mean absolute error as well as mean square error. And these are some of the papers that came out of it, that investigation. Okay, so now the question is between the mean square error and mean absolute error, right? Now, why people prefer mean square error, I already told you, right? It has some bunch of nice properties. But the problem with mean square error is, it has some obvious mistakes. I mean, it has a large penalty and things like that, right? So it's not robust to level noise. And mean absolute error is robust to level noise, but the problem with mean absolute error is, it's not smooth everywhere. So it's like, it looks like this, right? So there's an obvious point of singularity, right? So if we somehow can manage that singularity, and still for the rest of the landscape, we can retain the properties of mean square error, wouldn't that be nice? So this is something like a best of both worlds. So here comes a loss function, which is proposed as log of cosine hyperbolic of x. Okay. And a very simple Taylor series calculation will show you that when the x values are large, meaning away from 0, okay, this loss function behaves like mean absolute error. Very nice, right? Because then it does not have, for values away from 0, it doesn't suffer from the same problems that mean square error suffers. But while the values are in the neighborhood of 0, it behaves very nicely as mean square error. Nice, right? Okay. But turns out, can we do better? So the question is, okay, now that we have a loss function, can we do the same things that we have done with mean square error and mean absolute error and binary cross entropy, right? And what is that? That is like, can we come up with the Lipschitz adaptive learning rate for this kind of loss function and then use it to do prediction tasks, right? The answer is yes. And these are some of the results that came out of it, because it turns out that this particular function is actually not only convex, it's also strongly convex. I'm not going to get into the details of it, right? But strong convexity implies that its second order derivatives are also smooth, and it has, you know, some other bunch of other implications, right? Now, what is so other than the fact that this particular function is nice, has so many properties, it's also robust to label noise. What it means is that, you know, if there is slight perturbation in the label noise, right? I mean, slight perturbation in the data set, right? It's not going to change the label from 0 to 1 if you're talking about binary classification. Okay, all right. So that's a nice property. And we achieve that by using quantiles. And this is where the interpretability part comes into picture, right? So this is what a quantile looks like. Okay. Now, we know that if you train a deep neural network with sigmoid as the activation function and binary cross entropy as your loss, I mean, you will not be able to capture the, you know, uncertainty, because, you know, or, you know, if in a regression problem, if you use deep neural network regression problem, sigmoid plus MSE, because MSE means you assume that your distribution is centered around the mean and there is little deviation, you should be able to capture all uncertainties around the mean. That works nicely when your errors are normally distributed, right? But what about something like this? So on the left-hand side, it's still okay. I mean, mean is something which is, you know, something it's in the middle of it, right? You will see a bunch of data points which are very close to mean, right? But look at the right-hand side. At the right-hand side, you will see all of these different curves, right? And you will see a lot of data points which are actually away from the mean. And it is very, very difficult if you stick to mean, I mean, mean square error as a heuristic, it is very, very difficult to model these data points. Okay. All right. So, I mean, my internet is unstable here, so I'll just probably stop my video. So, okay. So now what this quantile means. So what we are trying to see are probabilities, right? On the left-hand side. And so it says that your probability of a function, which is a latent function, at a particular value of tau, right? I'll tell you in a minute what tau is, being greater than the value of the function itself, and that itself is tau. So if you have a lot of dispersion in your distribution, right? What it means is that this tau is the control parameter. So what it does, it controls the percentage of points lying below or under the graph. So for example, in this particular graph, if you look at the red one, which is the lowest bottom, right? This red one is at the quantile 0.1, which means that this should capture 10% of the points in the distribution, which will lie underneath the red curve. And rest of the 90% of the data points will lie above the red curve, right? Okay. So what it means is the following. You know, and you already know mean absolute error, right? We have already mentioned this in the talk. And then there are different values of this quantile tau, the control parameter, 0.1, 0.2, all the way to 0.9, and so on. Tau, when tau is 0.5, it is actually the median, and from where you actually derive the mean absolute error. Okay, so you see some of the robustness that we already talked about of mean absolute error comes naturally to this kind of setting, right? So if you add quantiles, it is easier for us to capture the uncertainty in the regression setting. Okay, all right. But we are not only solving regression problems, right? We also aim to solve classification problems. So how do we actually transfer some of that knowledge? We can transfer some of the knowledge only till at least what we have been able to do is that, a regression problem can be sort of framed as a binary classification problem. So what we are trying to recover in terms of the value of the latent response variable, we can change it to 0 and 1. Okay, so we have to do a thresholding, and then we can, sort of change the same definition to something like, it's not changing. Sorry. Okay. All right. So what it is that quantile regression as a technique is a much more generalized and extendable from the traditional mean regression. Okay. So what it does is that it models the relationship between the quantiles of the response variable to the dependent variable. Right? And a very special case of that is the mean absolute error regression. Okay. So what we, and the other incentive is that in the regression setting, the quantile regression is robust to level noise. Okay. All right. That we have already discussed. Now, here what we have done, or what it can be done, is that you change that regression model to a classification problem. So you threshold a binary response model, right, using an indicator function, right? And what you should hope for, or that's the goal, is that, you know, if I play around that quantile value tau, right, if I decrease my quantile value, is how far, I mean, what is the requirement to reach a reasonable confidence score? So when I talk about interpretability, what I mean is that we design something, we propose something called a confidence score, at least in the setting of binary classification, right? And the error that you see is actually not a normal distribution. It's an asymptotic Laplacian distribution, which is much more general than a normal distribution, right? In fact, if we do an experiment and if you set the tau is equal to 0.5, you will see that the distribution of the graph is very similar to a sigmoid, okay, which means a logistic, right? Okay, so the idea is, if I specify a bunch, if I give you a model, right, or if I give you a simulated data set, and if I specify a bunch of quantiles, right, can you generate the signal? So can you recover the latency? So in other words, let's say I have a sinusoidal curve, right? But I don't want to give you the sinusoidal curve. Instead, what I will give you are the quantile values of the sinusoidal point at several quantiles, right? Then I feed this to my deep neural network, and what the deep neural network doesn't know is the underlying distribution. It has no idea about the underlying distribution, but if it still can figure out that it is actually a sinusoidal curve and reconstructs it, right, then it actually, this is a property known as a coverage. And it turns out that this kind of quantile representation does an amazing job at that. Okay. So therefore, and this is called as coverage or signal request. So coverage is nothing but a quantifiable matrix which tells you how much of the original signal have you recovered, right? Okay. And so I'll show you a pivot, and this is exactly what I mean, right? So it's basically, you can see the one in the middle is the actual, the one in green is the actual sinusoidal curve, right? And the red one and the blue one are, and then actually there is also another graph which lies very, very close to the sinusoidal curve. So what really happens is the following, that not only I recover the signal on the actual curve, I also have a lower bound and upper bound, and these are the lower and upper quantiles of error. So I'll give you a useful example. I run a delivery business, right? And somebody has ordered. So he's my customer, he or she is my customer. Instead of telling my customer that, okay, your delivery will reach you in 30 minutes, right? Isn't it a much better idea that we say that, okay, your delivery will reach between 25 and 35 minutes? Right? So you have a lower bound, lower quantile and an upper quantile, right? The larger confidence may be in the upper quantile and lower confidence may be in the upper quantile, right? So you do an overestimation and the underestimation simultaneously so that you keep yourself safe, right? Because customer satisfaction at the end of the day is also important, right? Instead of giving a hard point-based estimation. So this is the difference between a quantile way of looking at things and a simple, mean square way of looking at things, okay? So what it does is that now with this, what we can do is that at every value of x, we can capture the range of values of the latent function, okay? Also, at every value of x, we can capture whether there are not samples of opposite class. So let me tell you what that means. So let's look at this. So this is a heart rate data set, okay? So where in the middle one, the blue one is the median, okay? Now, what I want to know is that how far away from the median should I be so that my class level will flip from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0, right? And I will define that as my confidence score. So a confidence score is for any sample is defined as 0.5 minus delta, where with the misclassification rate is 0.5 minus delta and confidence score of delta, right? So what this denotes is that the likelihood of another class level being present in my distribution. And can we also find how far away from the median the class level changes? So here you can see from the image, right? I mean, for a particular sample, so these are heart rates, right? For a particular sample, I'm sorry, the x-axis is the heart rate values, and this is this value, the one where you see delta equal to 0.4 has a corresponding heart rate of 160, right? So for this particular patient with a heart rate of 160, I need to move that far, right? So in order to get to a lower quantile, right? So this is far away from the median, correct? And I will need to shift that much in order for my class level to change from 1 to 0. Okay. Also, notice one other important thing. If my confidence is 0.5, my misclassification rate is 0. Okay, so which means so the way we set this up, the confidence score delta always varies between 0 to 1, and misclassification rate also varies between 0 to 1, right? Sorry, confidence score is 0 to 0.5, and accordingly the misclassification rate. Okay, so this tells me that if I'm not confident enough, right, if my confidence score is really low, like let's say 0.1 or something, then my misclassification rate will also be high, right? So for any instance with such low confidence rate, I can withhold the prediction instead of releasing it, right? And these are particularly important in the scenario of healthcare. And here it's just an AUC ROC plot where you can see that as and when my confidence increases, the area under the curve also increases. So when my confidence is at the highest is 0.5, the area under the curve that I cover is about 0.93, the highest. Okay, so these are just some performance validation metrics in terms of the confidence score. And now I don't have the time to go through all of this. I mean, these are theorems that helped us establish the same Lipschitzness of this binary quantile loss, right? And this also ensures that if we do things in a certain manner, I will always have a smooth curvature from where it's easy to pick up my quantiles and so on. And once again, I come back to log cosh h because we can impart a quantile representation to log cosh h, right? And do both regression as well as classification. So I think this is a good point to stop. And if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Professor Snehanshu, for the really nice talk. So this is Divya from IIT Goa.
Yeah, hi Divya.
Yeah, hi. So the ACM folks had asked me to coordinate the question answer session. So
sure.
Yeah, so yeah, the floor is open for questions. So please unmute yourselves and ask any questions.
So I had a question.
I'm Bhaskar here.
Yeah, hi.
I'm Bhaskar Sundararajan, Goa University here. Thank you for the talk here. And I just wonder because ultimately the challenges of data drift and extrapolation and how feasible extrapolation is possible, because all is interpolation. Basically, all ML model, deep learning models are interpolation. Whatever that hyperparameter you do it, convexity is not going to be the easy thing, right? So how far what you're talking about makes sense when it comes to data drift? Data happens in the model.
I mean, if you are talking about covariate shift, right? I guess you are talking about covariate shift. So there are two kinds of shifts, right? One is if you have label noise, right?
Yes.
So for using quantized losses, because they have satisfied Lipschitz property and the mean absolute error, right? We have shown that it is robust to label noise, which means if there is a delta shift in the level, right, the corresponding shift will also be controlled by the same delta. Okay, so these are results, and these are theoretical and empirical results that we have already shown. Covariate shift, however, is a much more difficult problem, right? So at least in the case of binary classification, I mean, I wish I had more time to talk about the quantiles. At least in the case of binary classifications, we can handle the covariate shift as well as reflect, because I mean, if you read the quantile regression papers by Prabal Chaudhuri and, Goenka and all, they already have results which are like 30, 40 years old, which says that, if I know all the quantiles, right, I actually know everything about the underlying distribution. And you don't need to give me the distribution, okay? But there are certain properties that are implicitly assumed, right? Convexity, I mean, to be honest. So if your underlying distribution is non-convex, right, and non-smooth, then I don't think detecting covariate shift is possible. But if otherwise, it is possible.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, and it's interpolation, it is not extrapolation.
Yes,
Okay,
of course.
understood.
Of course it
Yeah.
is. And then PL inequalities like PL inequality are used, But
Okay.
once again, the underlying assumptions is that there has to be convexity, which actually is always not true when you are doing it in the context of deep neural networks. Right? So we assume that there is approximately convex and things like that, right? Okay.
Yeah. It looks a lot of effort for me, from my side, I understand. A lot of effort to try to achieve parsimony computing. We are looking at it.
Right.
But
I mean, on the theoretical side, there is, I mean, so what at least the focus of my research group is that, I mean, we want our efforts to be concentrated on the conceptual side rather than on the architecture side. So we don't want to spend a lot of time on tuning architectures. So which is why sometimes it's more time taking, because since doing proving theorems is sometimes more harder than doing the hard engineering optimization. But yeah, so sometimes it pays dividends, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah. Okay.
So maybe Satya, you can ask.
Yeah, fine.
Yes, so I was there are statistical guarantees that are given in like your regression problem, right? You mentioned. So confidence intervals exist. So how does it compare with that, your approach versus the confidence intervals that are coming in usual statistical interpretation of regression?
Well, for quantile regression, I have as I said, the confidence intervals are, the thing is, the example that I was giving you, right? I mean, I have asked you to recover a sinusoidal function, right? Without telling you it's a sinusoidal function. So all I have given you are the different quantile values, 0.1 to 0.9, right? A bunch of quantile values. What the deep neural network trained with the quantile laws gives me is not only the underlying sinusoidal distribution, right? It also gives me the lower bound as well as the upper bound. So let me go back to my screen. Where is it? Sorry. Yeah. So let me go back. So I'll show you this. Yeah, this one, right? So there is, again, I can compute precisely the confidence intervals for each one of these predictions from a regression setting point of view. If you change the regression problem to a binary classification problem, there is no straightforward confidence computations, which is why we had to design that confidence score, right? So to answer your question, in short, is that yes, it's statistically, everything that we experimented on, the confidences we were always able to compute the confidences for all the point predictions. And remember, this is not a point prediction, right? So when you have a band, naturally your confidence will be high. Because in a mean square error regression setting, what you do is a point prediction, right? Which is why sometimes in your regression model, I mean, you have to do this 95%, 90%, 95%, 99% confidence prediction for each of the coefficients that you come up with, right? But here it's natural. The problem is somewhat different. The problem is there is something known as quantile crossing, right? Which is, maybe a 0.2 quantile cross with 0.8 quantile cross. That kind of thing happens. And in a multi-class classification setting, that is still an open problem. But in the binary class classification setting, we could use regularization to prevent such things happening. So one line answer to your question is yes. I mean, we are pretty confident. I mean, In fact, there is another graph which I was explaining, right? I mean, in the classification setting, if the confidence score increases in my prediction, I am actually able to cover way more area under the curve, right? Which is a statistical representation of how robust our prediction is in the context of binary classification only.
So yeah, so I had one question regarding, how the 1/L rate, how does it compare with, the standard techniques for the like exact line search, for instance?
I mean, at least for the data sets that we experimented, and that includes CFAR10, CFAR100, as well as the gene expression regression problem. I mean, we are state of the art in terms of number of epochs to converge, right? In certain data sets, we are only 1%, 1.5% off in terms of prediction accuracy.
Okay. That's a
Yeah.
reasonable.
Yeah. I mean, you are free to test the code. It's already, I mean, it's there in my presentation. I'll share with Kargi.
Sure. I think that will benefit.
Yeah. All
right. So I guess in the interest of time,
Yeah.
we have to stop. So it was a very nice talk.
Thank you so much.
On computing resources and stuff. I think we really need that kind of a focus on, energy efficiency and all. So yeah, thanks a lot, Snehanshu, and also thanks to all the attendees for participating. Okay, so thanks everyone. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.